I grew up in northern BC as a First Nations girl. Picking pine cones was my first job at 4 years old. And when I learned about the inequalities in the federal government's provision of public services for First Nations children, I was like probably many of your listeners who, when they see a human rights breach, you look around, you think, wow, I really care about that, but it's not me who should be leading that. I'm not, I don't know enough about it, or I don't have enough experience. And so I'm not going to step across that line. And I guess I'm an example of when you do, you realize that there's other good people there who have already stepped across that line, that you are not alone, and that there will be people there to teach you and guide you. And in fact, you have to make a difference. So that would be my number one thing to share, is don't be a bystander like I was for far too long.
And I feel like that's so, I think something that resonates a lot with university students who after high school were never really exposed to some of the realities that existed in Canada. But then once you come into university and are kind of exposed to more different narratives and histories and experiences, you're able to cultivate your own understanding of what's happening and kind of no longer be that bystander that you're talking about.
Right. And the federal government really wants to eradicate racial discrimination, including the type that affected Joyce. They first of all need to embrace the fact that they are racially discriminating, and they need to stop that. And they need to put systems in place so it doesn't recur. And the same goes for Premier Legault in the Quebec government. You can't fix a problem that you won't even have pass your lips. I would argue the government of Canada's provision of the Indian Act, along with its racial discrimination against children in our case, sets an example and gives permission for people in other professions and other walks of life to replicate that racist behavior. It's not enough for the Prime Minister to take a knee on Black Lives Matter and still have the Indian Act going on, right? And the Vienne Commission has already named systemic discrimination against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Quebec as a problem. And the Quebec National Assembly apologized for it just last year. So to have the government think, well, we apologized last year, and so therefore it no longer exists, in the face of that very tragic footage of Joyce, is just undescribable.
I want to get into that, exactly what you're talking about, those rosy political statements that we so often hear from establishment politicians, making these promises of nation-to-nation relationships with the Indigenous people. How do we how do we confront when rhetoric doesn't match action?
Is that they address critique from the perspective of the public relations exercise versus the public interest.
Oh.
And they want to spin things so they look good all the time. It's when you take up the language of the other side, even if you're arguing against it, you reinforce it. So the important thing is that we on our side learn about framing and get the government to respond to our frame and invite the public into our frame. In these circumstances, the sad reality is, at least for First Nations kids, they knew they were racially discriminating against them. They actually had internal briefing notes where they would call the situation dire. They had an assessment that said that not only were the deaths of children likely, they were going to happen in high numbers. This is all in the public record of their own documents that were eventually disclosed before the tribunal. I think that once you have that, once you know that, you realize that it's not about convincing the government to change. You have to go around the government to the people. Yeah. Because governments, in my view, although there's good people in government, it's as a system, it operates as a sociopath. It is really self-interested. They are not moral and they're not logical. If you think that you can convince governments who are resistant to positive change through moral and logistical arguments, that's not going to happen. So you still have to be moral, you still have to be ethical, and you have to be evidence-based, but you go around the government to the public and you start to change the climate in which the government operates. And so if the government knows that it can't survive because the public thinks this is important, then change will happen. The federal government's tactic has been over the years is when the public kind of gets outraged, as many Canadians are, about the lack of water, like people don't get that, right? We have broadband access in the space station. So if remoteness was a reason, Why can't we get it up to northern BC? And the population up there is 6 at best, right? Canadians are smart enough to realize all of this. And what it is that you have these consistent inequalities. So the government sees the public get upset about an issue. And what they'll do is they'll say, well, we're going to invest in water and we're going to deal with some of the boil water advisories. And then there's a shell game that goes on. And you've seen this with the Auditor General's report that just came out on long-term boil water advisories, where the government would say, well, we've ended a long-term boil water advisory because we're now trucking in water to the community, right? So they're not dealing with the long-standing inequalities in education, in housing, in sanitation systems, in child welfare, in basic recreation places for young people or play spaces for children. All of those are underfunded. And so the government's approach to try and mediate this in the public is do it one program at a time and one drop at a time, but avoid actually equitably funding the whole public services.
I think that especially since the pandemic and we've seen this huge amount of wealth been able to be accumulated and distributed to Canadians,
Yeah.
I think has never been more apparently clear that the government could invest in all of these services, in public services, in educational service, recreational services. I think the pandemic has opened the eyes to many of the young people who are like, if we can take out billions of dollars for all other Canadians, why are Indigenous children not worth it, the money?
Yeah.
And
That's $1 million question. That's exactly
is that what it comes down to? Whether the federal government believes Indigenous children are worth the money?
It also is about control. I think it gets right to the colonial thing. They don't like being told what to do. And that's why I think that they've resisted so many of the orders. Thanks to the good work of the Tribunal, we've actually been able to get First Nations kids about 800,000 services, but we had to litigate for every one of those services against the government. And as you say on compensation, for those kids who have already lost their childhood, in some cases their lives, the Canadian government actually litigated in the middle of the pandemic against us because we wanted to ensure that children who had passed away as in ways that were linked to Canada's discrimination were compensated, their estates were compensated. Canada said, no, we don't want to pay these people. It really gets to this lack of ethic. I think they're completely out of step with what Canadians think. Like they have said to me time and time again, well, if you want to change things, you have to change the minds of Canadians. I said, no, I said, I've been all over the place. I said, I've talked to people of every political persuasion, lots of people of other diversities. When people know that these kids are getting less because of who they are, people are just appalled by that. It's you that's in the dark ages, not the Canadian public. But the Canadian public needs to drag the government along.
And I think it's really frustrating because how do you bring this into the eyes and television screens of apolitical, apathetic people who don't really, to be honest, care enough to put on the TV?
You know what? It's people like you that give me great hope and your listeners. What I'd invite all of your listeners to do is sharpen your pencils and get involved in this movement. We actually have an apartheid system in Canada. People don't like to think that, but that's what we have. We have reserves. Think about that. Think if I were to grab a group of McGill students of one particular diversity and put you all on a reserve, right? And then cut your services by 30 to 40%. And then I'll ask you to be grateful to me when I alleviate partially one of those areas of inequality. Your job is to be grateful to me and because I'm going to say to the Canadian public all the good stuff I'm doing for you. That would be outrageous. And yet that is exactly what is happening in this country.
I wanted to discuss with you how, in fact, our child welfare system is apartheid in many, many ways that you just described, and why apartheid as a term should be ringing bells in young people's minds about the severity of this oppression.
Well, in 1948, actually, a delegation from South Africa arrived in Canada to study the Indian Act, to study the reserve system, the pass system, and the status card system. And they actually took that back to South Africa to implement in apartheid South Africa. So when I was privileged to teach human rights in Durban in South Africa, I showed everybody my Indian Act status card, and they showed me their Black identity cards, and they're almost like parallels of one another, right? We ceded apartheid in South Africa. That is something that is part of Canadian history. Mm-hmm. And we have an Indian Act. We have the only race-based act in the Western industrialized world, right? It determines, imagine as if a baby is born, a First Nations baby is born. One of the first judgments that Canada makes is whether you are a status or non-status First Nations child, according to them. Now imagine if we rolled that out to other people, right? That the Canadian government is going to decide if you're status or non-status, whatever, right? And the federal government's unequal treatment of First Nations is deliberate. And they've had solutions and available to remedy all these problems, but they choose not to do it. So it looks like they're doing something when they're actually changing nothing on the ground, and they're maintaining their power.
How should we respond to those, those blanket assertions that, oh, you can't solve a centuries old thing in a couple of years? How do you confront that?
Well, what I say to government is I say, it's interesting when this complexity argument comes up, right? If we think about CERB, they didn't say, oh my God, we're never going to be able to do this, put out checks to be able to support Canadians in that short amount of time. Governments actually are supposed to do complex things. And in this particular case, what they're doing is they're using this argument to suggest to Canadians that there isn't a solution. That's implicit in it. What they don't want you looking at is the fact that they already know what they're discriminating. They already know that children and families and young people are dying as a result of this, being severely harmed, separated from their families. They know all that. And they also know that they're choosing, despite that, to not remedy the problem. And that's where they don't want Canadians to look. So they're trying to say, don't look over here, look over here,
complete
look over here. Yeah.
And I would like to even expand on that and say that, like, emphasizing complexity is in and of itself so racist, because then you're saying that that these people are so complex that we can't afford them basic human rights. Is that like the argument you're pushing forward? That's
right. And what I've said to the government is, well, what I want is culturally based equity for First Nations children. You already seem to have achieved that for the other millions of children in Canada. So why is discrimination easier for you for First Nations kids?
Another often reprisal that I think activists get, especially young people in university campuses get from people of different political persuasions, is there's too much division between Indigenous nations, that it's too difficult to form a consensus, even among Indigenous people. How would you explain this to young people? Okay, and where does this even come from? Is it even based in accuracy or anything?
Yeah, I just a few blocks from here is the House of Commons. And I don't know how many times they've actually agreed on things. There are areas of broad-based agreement. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the Eradication of the Indian Act are subject to repeated votes, unanimous votes by the Assembly of First Nations to eradicate the Indian Act and to affirm First Nations rights. That's not a matter of controversy. The wanting to eradicate the discrimination so that First Nations children, youth, and families have equitable services, that's not a controversy. You don't see First Nations out there protesting, we don't want a proper school for our kids. Like, all of this is nonsense, right? You know what? I got this document. I'm going to send it to you. I found it in my archives. It's called Stealing Indian Rights. And this was from 1958, who was working in Indian affairs and got fired. And what he says is, the art of denying Indians their human rights has been refined to a science by the government. The following list of commonly used techniques will be helpful in burglar-proofing your reserves and rights. And there's a couple in here that I think, we've hit on. One is, make the Indian believe that you are working hard for him. putting in as much overtime and at a great sacrifice, and imply that he should be appreciative. This is the ultimate in skills for stealing human rights, when you obtain the thanks of your victim. And then here's another one that I fear often, is appeal to the Indian sense of fairness and tell him, even though things are pretty bad right now for him, he should make strong protests. Because keep the argument going on this and avoiding the real issue and refuse to deal with him while he's protesting. Take all the fire out of his efforts. So these are the strategies we've seen as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples leveraged by colonial governments since Confederation and even before.
As a political science student, just hearing that language and framing just reminds me of an authoritative, paternalistic state trying to control this outgroup through internal and external domination. Like, that's how I see it. That kind of language kind of speaks to that method of control that the federal government has enacted since Confederacy to control and to manipulate the sentiments of the most vulnerable segments of our population. How do we make Canadians confront all of our nation's interrelated flaws?
For Native Americans, it goes a step further, and that is that we were the original landholders of this nation. And what we want is some kind of moderated separation, something like Quebec has already gained under the Constitution, where we actually have our pre-existing rights to the land and resources affirmed, and our rights to self-government affirmed. So in that way, it's different. But what I do say is that I think one of the mistakes that people make in human rights is they think, well, and I got a lot of this actually suggested to me with the Syrian refugee crisis, which is, well, we shouldn't be taking in more people when we're not even treating our own properly, right? And what I say is, if we believe in human rights, we believe in it for everyone. And so we need to stand, you can't just believe in human rights for yourself and not for others. And you need, and that's part of our First Nations tradition too, which is the reason why we helped out the British and the French and made sure they didn't starve when they first came here. So we have to make sure that we're supporting the values of human rights across different struggles. But at the same time, what we don't want to do is kind of assume that the drivers of it are the same. Like, what I would love for people to do is that Google search of the Indian Act. Because when you talked about that control and domination, I don't think the Indian Act is very much different than what we would find, say, in the Russian Federation or in China, the level of control, right? The defining of who you are, putting you on a specific piece of land and telling you it's a reserve, underfunding all of the services. They could even, the Minister of Indian Affairs can even overturn your estate, your will, if they think you haven't left it to the proper people, or if the government wants. It's very colonial, right? And we need to just look at that and imagine if you were subject to this. Would you want yourself or your family to be? And do we really want to live in a society where that is there? Because one of the things that happens, I think, is people, the average person who's learned nothing about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, they hear us and they think we're complaining all the time. Well, the reason we're complaining all the time is because the rights violations are of a serious gravity that aren't experienced by other Canadians. If you are subject to the Indian Act, first of all, you don't own the reserve land, right? You don't own your house on reserve. So what if I applied that to everybody in Canada? And then you try to create a business or create assets out of that. Like, it wasn't until recently, like if you had a cow on reserve and if I sold the cow, I actually could be prosecuted because the cow is actually not my cow. The cow belongs to the Crown, right? Like, these are the kinds of crazy things that First Nations folks experience. It's mind blowing.
As someone who bought into that model minority myth and, came into uninvited lands and basically and started my own life here, I think there's like this politics of responsibility that is on citizens of this country to realize that the systems we are living in are oppressive and that we can actively resist and do good. And I think that's the main thing I wanted to get out of our discussion with you, is the fact that all of us are immigrants on this land and settlers on this land. We're all uninvited guests, and we are all equally responsible to hold ourselves accountable in not being complicit. Is there a solution that lies in greater political representation in the Canadian government of introducing them into politics, or is it based on self-government and nation-to-nation relations, and there shouldn't be representation in Canadian government of Indigenous people?
I think it's a yes and kind of answer, but what I would say is that the Canadian government is still a very colonial structure. Because what happens is that the government has said you have to be fluent in English and French, both colonial languages, in order to serve at the senior levels of government, including at Indian Affairs. So if I was fluent in French and Cree, I would be ineligible for a public service senior position. So what happens is we often have, frankly, white folks from Quebec or Eastern Ontario, not even across the diversity of the country. Government's answer is, well, go and take French lessons or go and take English lessons. But for us, that's an adoption of another colonial language when our own languages were outlawed and persecuted. There's that. And then there's also the Supreme Court of Canada, which interprets our rights. Do you know, McCall, there's never been a person of color on the Supreme Court of Canada? Never. Never. Let alone a First Nations, Métis or Inuit person. The Supreme Court Canada, by the nature of its jurisprudence, will hand down a large number of decisions on First Nations, Métis or Inuit peoples and persons who are a refugee status. That's the nature of the law. And yet there's never been a person of color, a First Nations, Métis or Inuit person on the bench. And one of the things that Trudeau has done is say, no, we're all having bilingual justices. We've overcome residential schools where we got a grade 3 education. There's now a fantastic group called the Indigenous Bar Association. Many qualified First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lawyers who could sit on the Supreme Court, but are disqualified because of Canada is privileging the French and English language requirement.
And for how diverse Canada is and how diverse Canada is going to become.
Yeah.
Having a political system that only allows free entry of French and Anglophones, like dominantly white French and Anglophones, makes it a situation where you have this incredibly diverse country that's represented by just two groups, even though there are so many minorities that exist within Canada itself. So I think people hearing that in Canada, we haven't even had a person of color in our Supreme Court is something that I should have already known, number one. And number two, we should be equally as surprised and outraged by that fact, considering we have political parties that are led and headed by people of color. So that is not at all reflective of the political realities of the country, and our legal system should reflect that as well.
You know, that's supposed to be a check system on government colonial power. So my main point is, like, you can hire First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people into government, but unless you change those structures so that it really is one that is embedded in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights and is respectful of those people, then all you're doing is tokenism, right? Yeah. And, you know, I really recommend people look at the good examples of Romeo Saganash, for example, who served as for a First Nations member of Parliament, and read some of the stuff he was saying about serving in that particular institution. Or look at the example of Senator Murray Sinclair, the former Truth and Reconciliation Commission person, and what he says about service in those kinds of areas. Them and Lily and Dick and many others who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have served in government architecture and have provided very constructive critiques, but those critiques are often not actioned. And so the space continues to be unwelcoming.
So are there two Canadas? Can you expand on that? Like, are we currently living in a country where Canada means one thing for me and another thing for First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and other Indigenous nations? Do we live in that kind of apartheid system?
Yes. Yeah. So it's Canada, right? So there's Canada for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and then there's Canada for everyone else. And that is the apartheid kind of regime that we have here. And I need to tell you that it's intentional, right? It's intentional. Canada chooses to keep people in the dark. Or that's why they put all these flowery public relations announcements without trusting Canadians with the truth. And that's why it's so important people read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, the Vienne Commission in Quebec. They support Joyce's principle. They read the Auditor General's reports. I always say to Canadians, if you're skeptical about what I believe, great. Now what I want you to do is try and do your own research. Check out the Auditor General's reports, check out the Parliamentary Budget Office, and try to disprove what I'm saying. Skepticism is fine. As long as that leads to curiosity and you actually learn an education. And I think what you're going to find is this pretty compelling evidence in legal orders, in independent observers, that what I'm saying is sadly true. And then you're left with an opportunity. You can go onto our website and find those 7 free ways to make a difference. And don't just send one letter, keep on sending emails, keep on Twitter. It's easy, right? Even in COVID, tag Justin Trudeau. I did that this morning, right? FYI, he never writes back. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be silent. I think that's one of the things that people need to understand in human rights is you have to keep on talking, even when no one's listening, because one day someone will.
Exactly. And I think I want to capture that exactly because I think so many young people, especially in universities, say, oh, I don't really want to, that's just performative activism. I'm just being performative. I don't really have an impact. I don't want to, be a snowflake liberal. I can't even believe these are some of the conversations that our generation has with one another. But would you tell them that, yes, it matters to send that letter. Yes, it matters to send that tweet. Yes, it matters to do that hashtag. And it actually has an effect. Like, would you tell them that?
Yeah, I would say that colonialism has infused academia and even activism. I, as a First Nations person, backed by a resolution of all the First Nations chiefs, have created campaigns that in asking you to be a part of it. So if you're telling me, I don't want to engage because I'm a white liberal, what you're telling us is that we are somehow colonial. Well, what we've developed is colonial. We actually know what we're talking about. This is our experience. We're sophisticated enough to make sure that our campaigns are decolonial. What we want is for you to simply support us in our own self-determination in our future. So there's a difference between a non-Indigenous person thinking, well, and I've had a few of these. People call me up and say, you know what the real problem is? You may not have known this before. There's that group. That's not what we want. And I would say it's an abrogation of your moral responsibility not to support those things. And one of the things you brought up was, the immigration question. And what I say to folks is you often came here or were born here because your ancestors fled human rights abuses in your own lands.
Literally, yeah.
And sometimes part of your own defense mechanism was a believing in the idealism of Canada because you didn't want to believe, you wanted to find safety for your family. And I understand that. So you wanted to believe that Canada was all these things it was telling you. Patriotism is when you embrace what really hurts in your own country and you care enough to lift it up to the values it espouses. That's a patriotism.
Because we want to be on the right side of history. Because for far too long, I think generations before us have been on that wrong side of history and have not been outspoken when they've needed to be outspoken. So I'm actually gonna turn it over to some student questions.
Okay.
They sent in some questions to us that they wanted to ask you. The first one is, I'll just say it now. My father is a social worker who works with former foster children who have aged out of foster care and thus no longer have access to government aid. How does this phenomenon affect Indigenous foster children, and what do you see as reasonable ways to address this?
Oh, such a good question. You know that First Nations kids are 12 times more likely to be in foster care, and a lot of that has to deal with those inequalities in public services. It's poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse related to residential school trauma, and domestic violence. Those are the reasons that drive those kids into care. And then you have the unequal funding of child welfare, which meant those kids stayed in care because the family there wasn't services to keep them out of care or to reunite them. And what happens is that the federal government washes their hands of them as they're 18. And here's the other thing on an economic angle. You talked about a compassionate society being a just society. An equitable society is really key. Equity is the closest thing we have to a social bullet in economics and in social sciences. So by really equitably supporting these young people, it's going to pay off in spades down the line as they're less reliant on all kinds of services that we have to refer persons who are suffering to. So it makes no sense. So advocate for post-majority care, minimum 25.
Next question that someone asked, which is, how does the current foster care system differentiate or have similar characteristics to the 60s scoop?
They both do the same thing. They codify structural discrimination, i.e. if I'm on reserve and I'm a parent, I have no water, there's inadequately funded at addiction services, my parents were in residential schools, all of that becomes my responsibility to fix. It gets codified in child welfare structured decision-making tools as the risk I'm posing to the child. Now, some of that I might actually be responsible for changing. But nowhere in child welfare law do they say, what is the structural discrimination that person cannot reasonably change that's affecting the risk of the children? And then what is the risk that that parent or that caregiver is facing that they can reasonably change? So that goes right from 1895 in residential schools. By the 1960s, 80% of the kids there were placed for not properly cared for. So when people talk about the 60s scoop, they think of the provincial systems, but they forget about the kids in residential schools, which were actually there for the same reasons, child welfare reasons. So the numbers on the 60s scoop to me are always undercounted.
Are we kind of approaching maybe the possibility of another generation of Indigenous children who have not been provided the necessary compensation to allow for further mobility? Like, are we dealing with another generation of residential kind of school Indigenous children? Like, is that what we're going towards?
The answer is yes, and that's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of legal finding. Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society in 2007 brought litigation against Canada, saying their underfunding of child welfare services and their failure to equitably fund other services for children via something called Jordan's Principle was racial discrimination. Canada threw all kinds of procedural motions at us to try and defeat the case so it would never be heard by the Canadian public. But it does get heard, and in 2016, that decision comes down, finding that the Canadian government's discrimination was knowingly separating First Nations children from their families in the numbers of the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And that Canada's failure to provide equitable services was harming children and indeed contributing to the deaths of some children. The Canadian government was ordered to stop. There was 2 ministers of Indian Affairs. This is under the Trudeau government now. Both governments of both political parties have been responsible, but this is under the Trudeau government. They come out and they welcome the decision, and then they do very little about it. And that's led to the multiple non-compliance orders. The tribunal ordered that these children who have, in some cases, lost their lives, in many cases, lost their families and their childhoods, ought to be eligible for the maximum amount of compensation under the Act. And here's the amount of the compensation we're talking about, $40,000. If I offered people, went out on the streets of Ottawa and said, I'll give you $40,000 if you give me your child, or if your child might not, I don't think I'd get many takers. And those that I did, I'd be really worried about. But we're going to court in June because Canada is trying to overturn that order. They're saying this is not fair to us. And it's important for people to realize who are listening to this. The government of Canada is saying they're doing this in the interests of Canadians. They are using taxpayer money and representing what they feel Canadians want. And that, to me, makes me sick. I don't mind paying for CERB or for supporting healthcare or seniors or students, any of that stuff I'm good with. I'll pay my share. But paying for this kind of nonsense, they spent I don't know how many millions of dollars fighting against kids and fighting against paying the estates of children who they have contributed to the deaths of. I just think it's immoral.
Okay, and can we also just completely confront a lot of people who say, well, what about the benefits that Indigenous people get?
Yeah.
Like they don't pay taxes, like they get whatever. I don't even know what kind of stuff people come up with these days, but can we talk about that?
Yeah, so that's part of the colonial narrative, right? Is that, Robert Williams says that the bottom of colonialism is a savage and civilized dichotomy. So everything we do is savage, and we're never grateful enough to the civilizer. On reserve, for on reserve income, you are exempt from taxation. But here's the kicker. The average on reserve income is about $15,000. The reason it's so low is because of those provisions of the Indian Act that hamper people from being able to make a good livelihood. Number two, the other thing is that First Nations under the Indian Act can't tax their own citizens, so they can't create their own tax base, right? And they also can't get revenue from lumber companies or resource companies that extract resources off of their land. That goes to the provinces, right? So there's all the stuff around that. And then on the free education thing, if I was to offer the average McGill student, what would you rather have? We're going to take you back to kindergarten. You can get 30 to 50% less and go to a school that the parliamentary budget officer will say in a vast majority of situations is in terrible condition. That means you may not get water, you might get some rats, and you'll get black mold. You can take that and then you get a chance at getting some subsidies for your post-secondary, or would you rather get the deal you got right now, right?
A lot of people use the pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, as an example in which some people were happy about the employment opportunities, whereas some other groups and nations were against it. And how can you can't win always? You know, people say that. Can we clarify that for our listeners?
Well, one piece of background information is another egregious things about the Indian Act is that it allowed for the dumping of industrial waste onto reserves. So about 75% of First Nations reserves have toxic waste, including the Grassy Narrows First Nation, where almost every single child in the school has mercury poisoning. And for those listeners who don't know, mercury poisoning leads to lifelong neurological deficits. I think we've been on the front lines of knowing what the hazards are of industrial contaminants because we've lived it. And we have been seeing rare diseases, cancers that aren't associated with anywhere else. This mercury poisoning example, other types of health disparities. On top of that, we actually believe that none of us exist apart from the earth. Without the earth as a life source, humanity does not exist. So First Nations are saying, look, not only for ourselves, but for the defense of humanity, someone has to stand up for the land. Because the colonial mindset is looking at the land as a resource for extraction. And even the issue of climate change is a very colonial kind of point of view, because that's only humans getting excited about the planet to the degree it's a risk to them. So it's a threat to humanity, therefore we're worried about climate change. That's a kind of colonial mindset. For us as First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and Indigenous peoples, we are of the land, we're part of it. We don't look at it as something separate from ourselves. And because we're of it, we actually have a higher responsibility to care for it. We're interdependent with it. Like we have ceremonies, for example, where we will give thanks to the fish we just caught. And the reason for that is you're reinforcing your relationship. You realize that that was a life that you took that is gifting you the gift of sustenance. Therefore, you have a responsibility back to that fish, right? Well, I would say, number one, these are our lands. Number two, we're standing up for it because we've been on the front lines of contamination. And we know the hazards of it in a way that Canadians are going to learn if they don't smarten up, frankly. And number three, we're defending the land, not only for ourselves, but for you too, and for the generations of children that will follow you.
I think that will really resonate with a lot of young people who have really committed themselves to climate change and that cause and that movement, which I think is intertwined, interdependent, and interrelated to the Indigenous self-determination movement. So I think that kind of leaves us on an optimistic note. Well, I'll leave with one final question to you. What is the single most important piece of advice that you would give to young activists, to aspiring writers and thinkers and people who want to make change in Canada? What is one thing that you would give them as advice?
I would say make sure that you're doing right instead of wanting to be right. That means that you're driven by the evidence and you're driven by the authority of those who are most affected. My other thing would be is activism actually is takes a lot of discipline and a lot of intellect. So study these movements from around the world, learn from those movements, and conduct yourself with dignity, because you are going to be representing certain values and you have to live those values in order to bring honor to the movement. And never base a movement on tears or anger. You do not defeat the darkness by feeding it more darkness. You have to base a progressive a human rights movement or an environmental rights movement on love. Only light and love defeat the darkness.